A 27-ton steel needle hung suspended above Manhattan. 860 feet below, the architect William Van Alen stood on the sidewalk, watching. His stomach churned. If the cables snapped, 54,000 pounds of metal would tear through 70 stories and crash onto Lexington Avenue. Rumors had circulated for weeks. A flagpole, people said. Some kind of ornament. This was no flagpole. The workers began pulling. The first section rose through an opening in the building's dome and descended into the 66th floor. Then the second piece. The third. Within 90 minutes, all 4 sections had been riveted together. A 185-foot spire now pierced the sky. The Chrysler Building had just become the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Taller than the Great Pyramid. Taller than the Eiffel Tower. 1,046 feet of steel, brick, and one man's obsession. 24 hours later, the stock market collapsed. This is the story of a railroad mechanic from Kansas who built that tower as a personal monument. Not for his company, for himself, for his children. A man who insisted his bathroom be the highest in Manhattan so he could, as one observer noted, look down on Henry Ford and the rest of the world. Chapter 1. The Mechanic Who Became a Millionaire. Walter Percy Chrysler arrived in the world on April 2, 1875, in Wamego, Kansas. His father, Henry, drove locomotives for the Kansas Pacific Railroad. His mother, Anna Marie, kept the household together while her husband worked the rails. When Walter was 3, the family moved west to Ellis, a frontier town, flat prairie in every direction. The railroad yard dominated local life, and the sound of steam engines filled young Walter's childhood. His father was a Civil War veteran, warm-hearted but firm. He wanted his son to attend college. Walter had other plans. At 15, he dropped out of school. Within a year, he was delivering groceries 16 hours a day for $10 a month. He wanted to work with machines, not study them from books. His father resisted, but Walter was stubborn. At 17, he talked his way into an apprenticeship at the Union Pacific Railroad shops. The pay was 10 cents an hour. He took the job anyway. For the next 2 decades, Chrysler roamed the American West, working for one railroad after another: Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, Iowa. He built a reputation as a roundhouse mechanic who could solve problems that stumped the supervisors. Valve setting was his specialty. He rose through the ranks: foreman, superintendent, division master mechanic. By his early 30s, he had reached the pinnacle of his railroad career as works manager at the American Locomotive Company in Pittsburgh. His salary was $8,000 a year. Then came the automobile show. In 1908, Walter Chrysler attended the Chicago Auto Show. He had never driven a car. He had never owned one. But when he saw a cream-colored locomobile on the exhibition floor, something shifted inside him. The vehicle cost $5,000. His annual salary was $8,000. The purchase made no financial sense. He bought it anyway, $700 down. A $4,300 loan co-signed by a colleague. He had the car shipped to his home in Olvine, Iowa. Then he did something peculiar. He did not learn to drive. Instead, he pushed the locomobile into his barn and took it apart, piece by piece. He studied the engine, the transmission, the brakes. He reassembled it. Then he took it apart again, and again. By some accounts, he disassembled that automobile dozens of times before he ever turned the ignition key. Walter Chrysler did not simply want to own a car. He wanted to understand it, every gear, every valve, every connection. 3 years later, in 1911, he received a summons from a banker named James Storrow. The man asked if Chrysler had ever considered working in automobile manufacturing. Chrysler admitted that he had thought of little else since that day in Chicago. Storrow arranged a meeting with Charles Nash, president of Buick Motor Company. Nash needed a production chief who understood machines. Chrysler fit the description perfectly. There was only one problem. The position paid $6,000 a year. Chrysler was earning $12,000 at the locomotive works. Taking the job meant a 50% pay cut. He accepted without hesitation. At 36 years old, Walter Chrysler left the railroad industry forever. He arrived in Flint, Michigan, ready to apply everything he had learned about efficiency, production, and mechanical systems to a new kind of machine. Within 5 years, he would transform Buick into the most profitable division of General Motors. Within 15 years, he would build his own automobile company. And within 20 years, he would construct a tower that would change the New York skyline forever. But all of that began with a boy in Kansas who refused to go to college, a man who took apart his first car before he learned to drive it, an engineer who believed that understanding a machine meant knowing every single part. Chapter 2. $10 Million and a Dream. Billy Durant leaned across his desk and smiled. He could charm anyone. Walter Chrysler sat opposite, unmoved. Durant had just offered him $500,000 a year to stay at Buick, an astonishing sum. More money than Chrysler had ever imagined earning. But the offer came with a condition that made it worthless. Durant wanted control. He always wanted control. The two men had clashed for years. Chrysler believed in lean operations and careful spending. Durant believed in expansion at any cost. When Chrysler proposed outsourcing frame production to save $2 million annually, Durant announced plans to build a $6 million plant in Flint instead. When Chrysler streamlined Buick's operations, Durant sold the profitable Detroit dealership to a friend without even informing him. By autumn of 1919, Chrysler had endured enough. He told Alfred Sloan he was finished. All he wanted now was to sell his stock and walk away. Durant bought those shares for $10 million. A railroad mechanic who had taken a pay cut to join the automobile business 8 years earlier now ranked among the wealthiest men in America. He was 44 years old. He could have retired to his Long Island estate and never worked another day. Instead, he accepted the most demanding job of his career. Bankers controlling the failing Willys Overland Company offered Chrysler $1 million per year to attempt a turnaround. He took the job, but demanded to work from New York. The arrangement lasted 2 years. When owner John Willys refused to give Chrysler full authority, he moved on. His next project seemed like madness. Maxwell Motor Company had fallen from 4th place in American automobile sales to 10th. The company carried $32 million in debt. 26,000 unsold cars sat rusting in factory lots across the country. Friends warned Chrysler he was destroying his reputation. He saw something they missed. Maxwell had factories, distribution networks, and a workforce. What it lacked was a modern automobile. Chrysler hired 3 brilliant engineers from Studebaker. Fred Zeter, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer had been developing an advanced 6-cylinder engine. Chrysler gave them resources and freedom to build something extraordinary. The result debuted at the New York Automobile Show in January 1924. The Chrysler 6 featured hydraulic brakes on all 4 wheels, a high-compression engine, and engineering that rivaled cars costing twice as much. The price came in under $2,000. Dealers sold 32,000 units in the first year. Maxwell Motor Company was reorganized into Chrysler Corporation on June 6, 1925. Walter Chrysler, the Kansas mechanic, now commanded his own automobile empire. 3 years later, he purchased Dodge Brothers for $170 million, launched Plymouth and DeSoto, and watched Time magazine name him Man of the Year. He had built the 3rd largest automobile company in America, but factories rust. Sales figures fade from memory. Walter Chrysler wanted something permanent, a structure that would outlast him, outlast his company, outlast the century itself. He turned his attention to Manhattan real estate. Chapter 3. The Original Vision. The Chrysler Building was never supposed to be called the Chrysler Building. For 6 years, the plot at Lexington Avenue and 42nd Street sat undeveloped. The land belonged to Cooper Union, a private college that leased it to a Brooklyn real estate developer named William Reynolds. He had grand ambitions but no urgency. He paid rent on empty dirt while Manhattan grew taller around him. Reynolds knew how to build spectacles. In 1904, he had opened Dreamland at Coney Island, a 15-acre amusement park that cost $3.5 million. 1 million electric lights illuminated white neoclassical structures surrounding a central lagoon. A 375-foot tower dominated the skyline. dreamland drew hundreds of thousands of visitors who paid to watch simulated volcanic eruptions, biblical recreations, and trained animal shows. 7 years later, on the morning of May 27, 1911, workers accidentally ignited hot tar inside a ride called Hell Gate. The fire spread faster than anyone could contain it. By dawn, dreamland had burned to ash. Dozens of animals died in their cages. The tower collapsed onto Surf Avenue. Reynolds never rebuilt. He turned instead to Manhattan, where fortunes rose from bedrock rather than boardwalks. The Lexington Avenue plot became his next grand project. He would construct the tallest structure in the world. In 1927, Reynolds hired architect William Van Alen to design a 40-story tower. Van Alen had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and understood the emerging Art Deco style transforming European design. His original concept featured glass-wrapped corners meant to create the illusion that the tower floated above the street. A crystalline dome would crown the structure, glowing at night like a jeweled sphere. Reynolds loved the metallic crown. Van Alen initially resisted, but Reynolds insisted. This detail would survive into the final structure, though neither man could have predicted how dramatically it would evolve. By April 1928, Reynolds had signed a 67-year lease and finalized his plans. The Reynolds Building would rise 808 feet with 67 floors. Construction permits were approved in June. Architectural drawings appeared in trade publications that August. Groundbreaking occurred on September 19, 1928. Workers began excavating the foundation. Steel orders were placed. The Reynolds Building was becoming real. Then Reynolds ran out of money. The scale of his ambition had exceeded his financing. Construction costs mounted faster than he could secure investors. By early October, he faced a choice between abandoning the project entirely or finding a buyer willing to assume his lease, his plans, and his architect. Walter Chrysler had been watching. On October 15, 1928, Chrysler purchased everything Reynolds had assembled. The price exceeded $2.5 million. That same day, demolition crews arrived to tear down what little construction had begun. Chrysler intended to start over, taller, bolder, a structure that would carry his name and outlast his corporation. The Reynolds Building vanished from history before it ever truly existed. Chapter 4. Chrysler takes over. Steel eagles crouch on the corners of the 61st floor, beaks pointed toward the horizon, wings folded against the wind. They are enlarged replicas of the 1929 Chrysler hood ornament, bolted to the side of a skyscraper and visible from blocks away. Walter Chrysler specified every detail. The winged radiator caps jutting from the 31st floor, the hubcaps circling the 30th, the sunburst patterns radiating from the crown. Every surface would announce what he had built and who had built it. When Chrysler purchased the project from Reynolds in October 1928, he initially treated it as a simple investment. His children showed no interest in the automobile business. Thelma, Bernice, Walter Jr., and Jack would need income-generating property that required no knowledge of combustion engines or factory logistics. Manhattan real estate seemed ideal. Then Chrysler saw the architectural model. The lobby Van Alen had designed struck him as cramped and ordinary. A tower of this ambition deserved grandeur at street level, not a narrow corridor. Chrysler told Van Alen to redesign it completely. After that, the industrialist involved himself in every decision. The original Reynolds design called for 67 stories, rising 808 feet. Chrysler wanted taller. Van Alen revised the plans to reach 925 feet, surpassing the Woolworth Building downtown. At one point, Chrysler asked to remove 10 stories and reduce costs. Then he reversed himself, realizing that additional height meant additional publicity. The plans kept growing. No corporate funds would finance this tower. Chrysler wrote personal checks. The final construction cost reached approximately $14 million, the equivalent of $220 million today. Every brick, every rivet, every pane of glass belonged to Walter Chrysler alone. Van Alen transformed the design into a celebration of the machine age. The stainless steel cladding came from Krupp in Germany, an alloy called Narosta that would never tarnish. Triangular windows punctured the crown in radiating arches. The setbacks at the 17th, 24th, and 27th floors created a stepped silhouette unlike anything else on the skyline. Foundation excavation began in mid-November 1928. Workers dug 69 feet through Manhattan schist until they hit bedrock in mid-January. They removed 105 million pounds of rock and 36 million pounds of soil. Steel frame construction started on January 21, 1929. Carnegie Steel delivered the beams. The first uprights rose in late March. By June, the skeleton stood several stories high. By August, 35 levels of steel pointed at the sky. By September, the frame was complete. Workers had averaged 4 stories per week, a pace that seemed reckless. Yet not a single man died during the steelwork. The expected casualty rate for a project this size was 1 death per level above 15. More than 60 men should have fallen. None did. Chrysler required safety measures that other developers considered expensive. He required speed. He required elevators that ran at 900 feet per minute, despite city regulations limiting them to 700. When inspectors objected, Chrysler found ways to satisfy the letter of the law while ignoring its intent. The tower was becoming exactly what he envisioned. A structure in steel and brick that would outlast his company and generate rental income for generations. But Chrysler faced a problem. Another tower was rising downtown, designed by his architect's former partner. That tower intended to be taller. Chapter 5: The Feud That Changed the Skyline. 2 architects who once shared an office were now racing to build the tallest structure on Earth. William Van Alen worked uptown on Lexington Avenue. H. Craig Severance worked downtown on Wall Street. Neither man would speak to the other. Both intended to win. Their partnership had lasted 13 years. Van Alen brought imagination. Severance brought clients. Together they designed buildings that made both men wealthy. Then a 1924 article in Architectural Review praised the Albemarle building and credited Van Alen alone. Severance saw his name omitted from the work he had helped create. Lawsuits followed. The partnership dissolved. A friendship ended. 5 years later, they faced each other across the Manhattan skyline. Severance had been hired by a young financier named George Orstrom to design a tower at 40 Wall Street. The project began modestly, 47 floors, then 60. By April 1929, Orstrom announced the building would reach 840 feet with 62 stories, surpassing both the Woolworth Building and the Chrysler. Van Alen responded immediately. He revised his plans to reach 925 feet, Severance countered. He added a pyramidal roof and a 60-foot steel cap. His building would now stand 927 feet, 2 feet taller than the Chrysler. The newspapers called it the race into the sky. Reporters tracked each revision, each additional floor, each claim and counterclaim. Metropolitan Life announced plans for a 100-story tower. A developer named Lefcourt discussed 105 floors. Someone proposed a 1,500-foot building with a rooftop airplane landing field. The city had gone mad with altitude. Van Alen and Severance ignored the noise. Their focus remained on each other. Construction at 40 Wall Street began in May 1929. Builder Paul Starrett ran 3 shifts, 7 days a week, racing to meet a May 1930 lease deadline. Downtown, the steel rose fast. Uptown, Van Alen worked on something Severance could not see. Rumors reached Wall Street that the Chrysler Building had a secret. Van Alen had modified his design. The announced height of 808 feet was a lie. But no one knew the truth. Van Alen kept his plans hidden even from the workers assembling the steel. Inside the fire shaft of the Chrysler Building, a spire was being constructed in sections. 185 feet of steel, assembled in secret, waiting for the moment when it would emerge. On November 13, 1929, 40 Wall Street topped out. Severance and Orstrom invited the downtown elite to a ceremony celebrating their victory. 927 feet. The tallest building in the world. They were 3 weeks too late. In late October, workers at the Chrysler Building had hoisted the hidden spire through an opening in the dome. The 4 sections were riveted together before anyone downtown understood what had happened. Van Alen later compared the moment to watching a butterfly leave its cocoon. The Chrysler Building now stood 1,046 feet tall, 119 feet higher than 40 Wall Street, taller than the Woolworth, taller than the Eiffel Tower, the tallest structure ever built by human hands. Severance could not believe it. He considered adding more height to his own building, but the foundations would not support it. He tried arguing that the Chrysler's spire should not count because it contained no usable space. His associate, Yasuo Matsui, wrote articles making this case. No one listened. The final score stood permanent. Chrysler 1,046 feet. Wall Street 927. A partnership that began in 1911 had produced the 2 tallest buildings in the Western Hemisphere. Neither man ever spoke to the other again. Chapter 6. 4 floors a week. The men arrived before dawn. They climbed temporary ladders bolted to steel columns, ascending into fog and wind while Manhattan slept below. By the time office workers emerged from Grand Central, the construction crews had already been working for hours. Fox Movietone cameras captured them in 1929. The footage shows riveters straddling beams without ropes, plasterers leaning over edges 800 feet above the street, ironworkers wrestling steel into position with bare hands. One sequence shows a man casually walking across a girder, no wider than his boot, pausing to wave at the camera before continuing toward the building's edge. These images terrified audiences. They still do. Yet the work proceeded inside a system designed to prevent catastrophe. Walter Chrysler had spent decades in railroad shops and automobile factories. He understood that injuries slowed production and dead workers destroyed morale. So he required precautions that seemed excessive to other developers. Scaffolds with guardrails surrounded every work area. Tarpaulins stretched overhead to catch falling tools. Wire netting hung between toe boards. A hospital operated on site with a physician on duty every shift. A bulletin board posted daily safety updates. The job site functioned like one of Chrysler's assembly plants. Materials arrived precisely when needed. Cranes positioned beams before the concrete below had fully cured. Bricklayers followed steelworkers up the building like a rising tide, each trade working simultaneously at different elevations. The engineering firm, Ralph Squire & Sons, coordinated the logistics. Nothing waited. Nothing wasted. The numbers reveal the scale. 20,961 tons of structural steel hoisted into position. 391,881 rivets, heated red hot and hammered into place. Nearly 4 million bricks laid by hand to create walls that bore no structural load. 3,862 windows fitted into frames of German stainless steel. 3,000 men performed this work. The expected casualties for a project of this height ran to dozens. At the end, not one of those 3,000 had died. Chrysler celebrated the achievement publicly. Privately, he had always expected it. He had built his fortune by making factories safer and more efficient. The Chrysler Building was simply another factory, turned vertical, producing something more permanent than automobiles. By autumn, the exterior walls were closing in around the completed frame. Bricklayers worked downward from the crown while finishing crews prepared the lower floors for tenants. The building would open in months. But the world did not yet know its true height. Hidden inside the dome, waiting for the right moment, a secret weapon was about to emerge. Chapter 7. The Secret Weapon. No one outside the project knew it existed. While newspapers tracked every floor of the race into the sky, Van Alen worked on something he never announced. Permits were filed quietly. Steel was ordered without fanfare. The pieces arrived at the construction site in unmarked deliveries and disappeared into the building's core. The fire shaft at the center of the Chrysler Building rose like a hollow spine through all 77 floors. Normally, such shafts carried stairs and utilities. Van Alen repurposed this one as a hiding place. Inside the shaft, workers began assembling a steel needle that would transform everything. The vertex, as Van Alen called it, consisted of lattice steel framework with 4 corner angles and diagonal strut members. The finished structure would stand 185 feet tall and weigh 27 tons. It could not be hoisted from the ground in one piece. It could not be assembled on the roof in plain view. Van Alen needed secrecy, and the fire shaft provided it. Sections of the spire were delivered to the site, lifted to the 65th floor, and assembled inside the building where no one could see them. Scaffolding shrouded the dome, ostensibly to allow workers to finish the stainless steel cladding. In reality, the scaffolding hid what was happening within. Even the riveters did not fully understand. They fastened steel pieces together inside the shaft, following blueprints that showed dimensions but not purpose. Only when the sections came together did the shape become clear. Only then did the workers realize they were building a weapon in a war for altitude. Van Alen's cousin, William Edwin Squire, served as the project's structural engineer. He calculated loads and stresses, determining whether cables could lift 27 tons through the narrow opening at the top of the dome. The math said yes. The math did not account for wind, for equipment failure, for the 1,000 ways a plan could collapse 860 feet above the street. Rumors reached Wall Street. Severance heard whispers that Van Alen had a secret, that the Chrysler Building would somehow grow taller than announced, but no one knew details. No one had seen proof. Severance dismissed the rumors and concentrated on his own tower, confident that 927 feet would be enough. By mid-October, the hidden spire was complete. It waited inside the fire shaft like a sword in its sheath. Van Alen chose not to alert the press. He wanted no warning, no chance for Severance to respond, no opportunity for anyone to steal his moment. The newspapers would learn what happened only after it was done. Chapter 8. 90 minutes that changed everything. Van Alen felt sick. He stood blocks away, unable to watch directly, unable to look away. His stomach churned, his head swam. 860 feet above the street, workers balanced on wooden platforms around the dome of his building, preparing to do something no one had attempted before. The fears multiplied in his mind. The cables might snap under the weight and send 27 tons of steel crashing through 70 floors. The crane might fail to lift the sections high enough. The wind might shift and tip the needle over the edge, dropping it onto Lexington Avenue during morning rush hour. His cousin William Edwin Squire had calculated the stresses and declared the operation possible. Possible was not the same as safe. Rumors had circulated for days. Workers downtown at 40 Wall Street heard whispers that something was happening uptown. Severance's team noticed a derrick rising above the Chrysler Dome, visible against the October sky. The official explanation claimed they were hoisting a flagpole. No one quite believed it. The bottom section rose first. A derrick lifted it up the side of the building, cables straining, and lowered it through the opening in the dome until it settled into the 66th floor. The workers above guided the steel into position, fastening it to the structure that would support it. Then the second section, then the third, then the fourth. Each piece ascended the face of the tower, swung over the dome, and descended into the opening where riveters waited to fasten it to the section below. The needle grew taller with each lift. The building grew taller with each rivet. The work proceeded faster than anyone expected. The coordination that had built 4 floors per week now assembled a spire in less than 2 hours. By the time the final section locked into place, the Chrysler Building stood 1,046 feet above the sidewalk. Walter Chrysler watched from across the street. Van Alen finally allowed himself to breathe. No press had been invited. No photographers captured the moment. No reporters stood ready to announce what had happened. Van Alen wanted the victory complete before anyone could respond. He wanted Severance to learn the news only after the spire was already bolted into place and unmovable. The New York Herald-Tribune had covered the construction almost daily for months. They did not report the spire's installation until days after it occurred. By then, the scaffolding still shrouded the crown, and the full effect remained hidden. The gleaming needle would not emerge from its covering until spring, but the numbers were already fixed. Chrysler 1,046 feet. Eiffel Tower 986. Woolworth 792. 40 Wall Street 927. The race was over. The next morning, the stock market began to fall. Chapter 9. a monument in steel and chrome. The crown emerged from its scaffolding in spring of 1930, and New York had never seen anything like it. 7 radiating arches rose in terraced layers, each stepping back from the one below. Triangular windows pierced every surface, arranged in patterns that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel or the rays of a rising sun. The effect was deliberate. Van Alen wanted the building to appear to be reaching upward even while standing still, straining toward the sky with every line and angle. The material covering those arches was equally unprecedented. Nerosta steel, an alloy of 18% chromium and 8% nickel, had never been used on an American building at this scale. The German-manufactured metal resisted corrosion and cleaned itself whenever it rained. Unlike bronze, which turned green, or copper, which darkened, Nerosta would gleam as brightly in 50 years as on the day it was installed. Van Alen understood what that permanence meant. As one engineer wrote at the time, the bright metal accentuated the rising lines and diminishing forms of the crown so that the building literally dissolved into the sky. The Chrysler Building would not fade into the cityscape. It would shine above it. Below the crown, automobile imagery appeared at every setback. On the 61st floor, stainless steel eagles with wingspans jutting from the corners, their forms streamlined in the Art Deco manner. These were not the heraldic eagles of older buildings. They suggested flight, speed, the machine age in motion. 10 floors lower, at the 31st, replicas of 1929 Chrysler radiator caps decorated the facade, winged ornaments, hood emblems enlarged to architectural scale. The building announced itself as a product of its era, as sleek and modern as the automobiles rolling off Chrysler assembly lines in Detroit. Every decorative choice reinforced the connection. This was not a bank dressed in classical columns or a cathedral reaching toward heaven. This was a monument to industry, to commerce, to the belief that machines could be beautiful. Le Corbusier, the most influential architect in Europe, visited New York and offered his verdict on the Chrysler Building. He called it hot jazz in stone and steel. The description captured something essential. This was not a building designed by committee or constrained by convention. It was exuberant, confident, borderline outrageous. Critics would argue about its merits for decades. Some called it a masterpiece of modern design. Others dismissed it as flash without substance, a stunt evolved to make the man in the street look up. Van Alen did not care about the critics. Walter Chrysler did not care about the critics. They had built what they wanted to build. The exterior was complete. Now came the interior. Chapter 10. The Lobby and the Cloud Club. Visitors entering through the Lexington Avenue doors encountered a space that matched the exterior's ambition. The lobby walls were sheathed in red Moroccan marble, deep crimson with white veining that caught the light from bronze-framed windows. Amber onyx panels flanked the elevator banks. The floor gleamed with polished granite in geometric patterns. Every surface announced that this was not an ordinary office building. This was a palace of commerce. Above it all stretched what was then the largest mural in the world. Edward Trumbull's Transport and Human Endeavor covered nearly 8,000 square feet of ceiling, depicting the machinery of modern civilization. Airplanes banked through painted clouds. Ocean liners crossed stylized seas. The Chrysler assembly line appeared in motion, workers tending machines that produced the automobiles that had made Walter Chrysler rich. And rising above everything, the Chrysler Building itself, painted into its own ceiling, a monument celebrating a monument. The elevator doors became works of art in their own right. Brass and inlaid African woods formed stylized lotus flower patterns, each door slightly different from the others. Japanese ash met English gray hairwood and Asian walnut. Inside the cabs, American walnut combined with Cuban plum pudding wood and curly maple. 32 elevators served the building. No two interiors were identical. But the most exclusive space in the Chrysler Building was not the lobby. It was 66 floors above the street. The Cloud Club opened in July 1930 with 300 members, all wealthy men who formed the city's business elite. Texaco had demanded the club as a condition of leasing 14 floors. They wanted a proper restaurant for their executives. Walter Chrysler gave them something far more elaborate. The 66th floor featured a Tudor-style lounge with oak paneling and an Old English grill room with wooden beams, wrought iron chandeliers, and leaded glass doors. A Renaissance staircase in marble and bronze connected this floor to the main dining room above. The 67th floor was pure futurism. Polished granite columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with clouds. Etched glass sconces lined the walls. A mural of Manhattan covered the north side. Charles McGrath would later describe it as having a Fritz Lang sort of look, the aesthetic of Metropolis translated into a private dining room. Walter Chrysler maintained his own suite on this floor. Black etched paneling, a frieze depicting automobile workers, views of Central Park through triangular windows that slanted with the building's crown. Texaco executives had their own private room with murals of oil refineries and company trucks. The club offered amenities that reflected its era: a barber shop, a humidor for cigars, private lockers where members could store their own liquor, a useful feature while prohibition remained in effect, a stock ticker room for monitoring markets between courses. Edward F. Hutton lunched at the Cloud Club, Condé Nast, Juan Trippe of Pan Am, Gene Tunney, the boxer who had defeated Jack Dempsey. They gathered in a room that seated perhaps 80, far smaller than the Rainbow Room that would open at Rockefeller Center, but more exclusive, more intimate, higher above the city than any dining room had ever been. The club operated only during daylight hours. Members came for lunch, conducted business over meals that cost more than most Americans earned in a week, then descended to street level and returned to their offices. The Cloud Club was not a place for evening entertainment. It was a place for deals. It would remain open until 1979, closing only when the building itself began to decline, and corporations moved their headquarters to newer towers or suburban campuses. By then, the world it represented had vanished entirely. Chapter 11. The Architect Who Was Never Paid. In January 1931, William Van Alen attended the Beaux Arts Ball at the Hotel Astor dressed as his own building. The costume was extraordinary. Patent leather cape and boots in flame-colored silk, flexible inlays of the same exotic woods that decorated the Chrysler elevator doors. A towering headpiece shaped like the sunburst crown, complete with triangular windows. While other architects wore generic tunics beneath their building hats, Van Alen had commissioned something theatrical, something that announced his achievement to everyone in the ballroom. The theme that year was Fête Moderne, a fantasy in flame and silver, a celebration of the new architecture transforming Manhattan. William Lamb came as the Empire State Building. Leonard Schulze appeared as the Waldorf Astoria. Ralph Walker dressed as the Irving Trust Building. But Van Alen was the star. Photographers clustered around him. Newspapers printed his picture the next morning. It was the last public triumph of his career. Van Alen had made a catastrophic mistake when he accepted the Chrysler Commission. He never signed a contract. Walter Chrysler had purchased the project from William Reynolds, and Van Alen had simply continued working, trusting that payment would follow when the building was complete. The standard architectural fee in 1930 was 6% of construction costs. The Chrysler Building had cost $14 million. Van Alen submitted an invoice for $840,000. Walter Chrysler refused to pay. The automobile magnate claimed Van Alen had received bribes from building suppliers. He offered no evidence. He simply declined to honor the debt. The man who had built a monument to his own glory decided the architect who designed it deserved nothing. Van Alen sued. The courts ruled in his favor. He eventually received his full fee, but the lawsuit destroyed him. Architecture was a profession built on relationships and reputation. Clients did not hire architects who took their patrons to court. The Great Depression had already frozen most construction in New York. Van Alen found himself famous and unemployable at the same time. He never received another major commission. The critical reception had been mixed even before the lawsuit. Architect magazine called him the Doctor of Altitude. Kenneth Murchison compared him to Florenz Ziegfeld, the legendary Broadway producer. But other critics dismissed the building as flash without substance, a stunt design evolved to make the man in the street look up. Louis Mumford, the most influential architecture writer in America, called it a series of restless mistakes. Van Alen retreated from practice. He taught sculpture at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design. He watched other architects win commissions for buildings that would never match what he had created at Lexington and 42nd Street. He died on May 24, 1954. The obituaries were brief. 4 decades later, the Beaux-Arts Institute renamed itself the Van Alen Institute in his honor. By then, the Chrysler Building had been declared a National Historic Landmark. By then, everyone agreed it was a masterpiece. The man who designed it never lived to see that consensus form. Chapter 12. From Glory to Uncertainty. The Empire State Building opened on May 1, 1931, and the Chrysler Building was no longer the tallest structure on Earth. John Jacob Raskob had watched Van Alen's spire trick with alarm. His own tower had grown from 80 floors to 85, yet would still reach only 4 feet higher than the Chrysler. That margin was not safe. So Raskob added a 200-foot mooring mast for dirigibles, pushing his building to 1,250 feet. The airships never docked there. The winds made it impossible. But the mast served its real purpose. It put the Empire State Building 200 feet beyond anything Chrysler could add. The reign had lasted exactly 11 months. Some considered this failure. Others understood it differently. Height records existed to be broken. What mattered was whether a building remained worth looking at after its statistics became obsolete. Walter Chrysler died in August 1940. His children inherited the tower he had built for them. They sold it in 1953 to William Zeckendorf for $18 million. The decline began almost immediately. Successive owners cut maintenance costs. They drilled holes into the lobby ceiling to install cheap lighting, damaging the Trumbull mural. They used the spire to store junk. The observation deck closed. The Cloud Club lost members as corporations moved to newer buildings or suburban campuses. By the early 1970s, with New York City itself careening toward bankruptcy, the Chrysler Building's occupancy rate fell to 17%. The gleaming tower that had symbolized American ambition now stood largely empty, its steel eagles watching over a city in crisis. Designation as a National Historic Landmark in 1976 offered legal protection, but not salvation. The building kept slipping into disrepair. Massachusetts Mutual announced a $23 million renovation in 1978. The Cloud Club closed forever in 1979. Jack Kent Cooke purchased the building later that year. The entrepreneur and Washington Redskins owner hired architects to restore the lobby closer to Van Alen's original vision. More importantly, he completed the lighting system that had been part of the original design but never installed. In September 1981, 580 fluorescent tubes illuminated the triangular windows of the crown for the first time. The Chrysler Building glowed against the night sky as Van Alen had always intended. Cooke restored the exterior and spire in the mid-1990s. He died in April 1997. His creditors foreclosed almost immediately. Tishman Speyer and the Travelers Insurance Group purchased the building for approximately $220 million. They spent another $100 million on renovation. Evergreen Architectural Arts carefully restored the Trumbull mural, removing the polyurethane coating and filling the holes that had been drilled decades earlier. By 2005, the building was 95% occupied. The ownership continued changing hands. Abu Dhabi Investment Council, RFR Holdings. The land beneath the building still belonged to the Cooper Union, which had received it as a donation over a century earlier. The tower itself became a commodity, bought and sold by investors who rarely set foot inside. Yet something remarkable had happened during those decades of decline and revival. The critical consensus shifted entirely. Lewis Mumford had called the building a series of restless mistakes. The new generation of architects and historians called it a masterpiece. The American Institute of Architects ranked it among the most admired buildings in America. Tourists who visited the Empire State Observation Deck found themselves drawn to a different silhouette entirely. The sunburst crown, the triangular windows, the needle spire catching light. The taller building won the measurement contest. The more beautiful building won something else. The Chrysler Building still holds one record that can never be taken. It remains the tallest steel-supported brick building in the world. More importantly, it remains the building that New Yorkers point to when asked which tower they love most. Walter Chrysler wanted a monument. William Van Alen gave him one. Nearly a century later, it still gleams above Lexington Avenue, dissolving into the sky exactly as its architect intended.